you'd all like to hear this little story I have to relate. In the bosom of one of those spacious coves that indent the eastern shore of the Hudson, at that broad expansion of the river known as the Tappan Zee, there lies the small market town of Tarrytown, a name given, we are told, by the housewives of the adjacent countryside, whose husbands like to linger about the village tavern on market days. About 2 miles from this village, there's a little valley among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it, and the whistle of a quail or the tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever breaks in upon the tranquility. I recollect as a boy going squirrel shooting in a grove of tall walnut trees that shades one side of the valley. I wandered into it at noontime, when all nature is peculiarly quiet, and was startled by the roar of my own gun as it echoed in the stillness around. If ever I should wish for a retreat where I might steal from the world and its distractions and dream quietly away the remnant of a troubled life, I know of none more promising than this little valley. From the listless repose of the place and the peculiar character of its inhabitants, who are descendants from the original Dutch settlers, this glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land. Some say that the place was bewitched by a high German doctor during the early days of the settlement. Others that an old Indian chief, the prophet or wizard of his tribe, held his powwows there before the country was discovered by Master Henry Hudson. Certain it is the place still continues under the sway of some witching power that holds a spell over the good people. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs and are subjects to trances and visions and hear music and voices in the air. And the nightmare seems to make it the favorite scene of her gambles. The dominant spirit that haunts this enchanted region seems to be the commander-in-chief of all the powers of the air, is the apparition of a figure on horseback, without a head. It is said to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper, whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War. He's seen by the country folk hurrying along in the gloom of night as if on the wings of the wind. His haunts are not confined to the valley, but extend at times to the adjacent roads, and especially to the vicinity of a nearby church. Indeed, certain historians of these parts allege that the body of the trooper is buried in the churchyard, and his ghost rides forth to the scene of battle in nightly quest of his head. The rushing speed with which he sometimes passes along the hollow like a midnight blast is owing to his being in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. This legendary superstition has furnished materials for many a wild story in that region of shadows, and the specter is known at all the country firesides by the name of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. It is remarkable that such visions are not confined to the native inhabitants of the valley, but to everyone who resides there for a time. However wide awake they may have been before they entered that sleepy region, they are sure in a little time to begin to see apparitions. In this byplace of nature, there lived, in a remote period of American history, a man by the name of Ichabod Crane, a pedagogue or teacher, who, as he expressed it, tarried in Sleepy Hollow for the purpose of instructing the children of the vicinity. He was a native of Connecticut, tall but exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves. His feet might have served for shovels, and his whole frame most loosely hung together. His head was small and flat at the top, with huge ears, large green glassy eyes, and a long snipe nose so that it looked like a weathercock perched upon his spindle neck to tell which way the wind blew. To see him striding along the profile of a hill on a windy day, with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, one might have mistaken him for some scarecrow eloped from a cornfield. His schoolhouse was a low building of one large room, rudely constructed of logs, the windows partly glazed and partly patched with leaves of old copybooks. The schoolhouse stood in a rather lonely but pleasant situation, just at the foot of a woody hill with a brook right close by. From here, the low murmur of his pupils' voices might be heard on a drowsy summer's day, interrupted now and then by the authoritative voice of the schoolmaster, or by the appalling sound of the birch. Truth to say, he was a conscientious man, and ever bore in mind the golden maxim, spare the rod and spoil the child. Ichabod Crane's scholars certainly were not spoiled. He administered justice with discrimination rather than severity, taking the burden off the backs of the weak boys who winced at the least flourish of the rod, laying it on those of the strong, those little, tough, wrong-headed Dutch urchins who sulked and grew sullen beneath the birch. All this he called doing his duty by their parents, and he never inflicted punishment without following it with the assurance that he would remember it and thank him for it the longest day he had to live. When school hours were over, he was even the companion and playmate of the larger boys, and on holiday afternoons would convoy home smaller ones, if they happened to have pretty sisters or mothers noted for the treats in their cupboard. Indeed, it behooved him to keep on good terms with his pupils. The revenue arising from his school was small, and would have been scarcely sufficient to furnish him with daily bread, for he was a huge feeder, and had the dilating powers of an anaconda. To provide for his maintenance, he was, according to the custom in those parts, boarded and lodged at the houses of the farmers whose children he instructed. With these he lived successively a week at a time, thus going the rounds of the neighborhood with all his worldly effects tied up in a cotton handkerchief. That all this might not be too hard on the purses of his rustic patrons, he assisted the farmers occasionally, helping to make hay, mending the fences, cutting wood for the winter fire. He laid aside, too, the dominant dignity and absolute sway with which he lorded over his little empire, the school, and became wonderfully gentle and ingratiating. He found favor in the eyes of the mothers by petting the children, particularly the youngest, sitting with a child on one knee and rocking the cradle with his foot for hours. In addition to his other vocations, he was the singing master of the neighborhood. He picked up many shillings by instructing the young folks in psalm singing. On Sundays, he took his station in the front of the church gallery with his choir. Certain it is, his voice resounded far above the congregation, and there are peculiar quavers still to be heard in that church, and even be heard in the mill pond a half mile off, emanating from the nose of Ichabod Crane. The schoolmaster is generally a man of some importance in the female circle of a rural neighborhood, being considered a kind of idle, gentlemanlike personage, of vastly superior taste and accomplishments, and indeed inferior in learning only to the parson. Our man of letters, therefore, was happy in the smiles of all the country damsels. How he would figure among them in the churchyard between services on Sunday, gathering grapes for them from the wild vines that overran the surrounding trees, reciting for their amusements the epitaphs on the tombstones, or sauntering with a whole bevy of them along the banks of the mill pond, while the more bashful country bumpkins hung sheepishly back. Thus, by hook and by crook, the worthy pedagogue got on tolerably enough, and was thought, by all who understood nothing of the labor of headwork, to have a wonderfully easy life of it. From his half-itinerant life, also, he was a kind of traveling gazette, carrying the local gossip from house to house, so that his appearance was always greeted with satisfaction. He was, moreover, esteemed by the women as a man of great knowledge, for he had read several books, quite through, and was a perfect master of Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft, in which he most firmly believed. One of his sources of fearful pleasure was to pass long winter evenings with the Dutch wives as they sat spinning by the fire, with a row of apples roasting and spluttering along the hearth, and listen to their marvelous tales of ghosts and goblins, and haunted fields, and haunted brooks, and haunted bridges, haunted houses, and particularly of the headless horseman, or galloping Hessian of the Hollow, as they sometimes call him. He would delight them equally by his anecdotes of witchcraft, and of the direful omens and portentous sights and sounds in the air that prevailed in earlier times in Connecticut. But if there was pleasure in all this, it was dearly purchased by the terrors of his subsequent walk homeward. What fearful shapes and shadows beset his path in the dim and ghastly glare of a snowy night. With what wistful look did he eye every ray of light streaming from some distant window? How often was he appalled by some shrub covered with snow, which, like a sheeted spectre, beset his very path? How often did he shrink at the sound of his own steps on the frosty crust beneath his feet, and dread to look over his shoulder, lest he should behold some being trampling close behind him? And how often was he thrown into complete dismay by some rushing blast of wind howling among the trees, in the idea that it was the galloping Hessian on one of his nightly scourings? All these, however, were mere phantoms of the mind that walked in darkness, and though he had seen many specters in his time, daylight put an end to all those evils, and he would have passed a pleasant life of it, despite the devil and all his works, if his path had not been crossed by a being that causes more perplexity to mortal man than ghosts, goblins, and the whole race of witches put together, and that was a woman. Among the musical disciples who assembled one evening each week to receive their singing instructions was Katrina Van Tassel, the daughter and only child of a substantial Dutch farmer. She was a blooming lass of 18, plump as a partridge, ripe and rosy-cheeked as one of her father's peaches, and universally famed not merely for her beauty, but her vast expectations. She was a little of a coquette, as might be perceived even in her dress, which was a mix of ancient and modern fashions, as best set off her charms. She wore ornaments of pure yellow gold, which her great-great-grandmother had brought over from Holland. A tempting cinched waist bodice of the olden time, and a provokingly short petticoat to display the prettiest foot and ankle around. Ichabod Crane had a soft and foolish heart towards the sex, and it is not to be wondered at that so tempting a morsel soon found favor in his eyes, more especially after he had visited her in her paternal mansion. Old Baltus Van Tassel was a perfect picture of a thriving, contented, liberal-hearted farmer. He seldom, it is true, sent either his eyes or his thoughts beyond the boundaries of his own farm, but within those everything was snug, happy, and well-conditioned. His stronghold was situated on the banks of the Hudson, in a green, sheltered, fertile nook. A great elm tree spread its broad branches over it, at the foot of which bubbled a spring from the softest and sweetest water. Near the farmhouse was a vast barn, every window and crevice of which seemed bursting forth with the treasures of the farm. Inside the barn, a flail was busily resounding from morning to night. Swallows and martins skimmed twittering about the eaves, and rows of pigeons enjoyed the sunshine on the roof. Sleek, unwieldy porkers grunted in their pens, while a squadron of snowy geese were riding in an adjoining pond, convoying fleets of ducks. In the farmyard, turkeys gobbled and guinea howls fretted. Before the barn door strutted the gallant cock, flapping his burnished wings and crowing, sometimes tearing up the earth with his feet, then generously calling his ever-hungry family of wives and children to enjoy the rich morsel he had discovered. Ichabod's mouth watered as he looked upon this sumptuous promise of luxurious winter fare. He rolled his great green eyes over the fat meadowlands, the rich fields of wheat, rye, buckwheat, and Indian corn, and the orchards burdened with ruddy fruit. His heart yearned after the damsel who was to inherit these domains, and his imagination expanded with the idea of how they might be readily turned into cash, and the money invested in immense tracts of land, wild land, and shingled palaces in the wilderness. Nay, his busy fancy already presented to him the blooming Katrina with a whole family of children, mounted on top of a wagon, loaded with household trumpery, with pots and kettles dangling beneath. He saw himself bestriding a pacing mare, setting out for Kentucky or Tennessee or Lord knows where. But when he entered the house, the conquest of his heart was complete. It was a spacious farmhouse, with high ridged but sloping roofs, with eaves forming a covered piazza along the front, capable of being closed up in bad weather. Under this were hung flails, harness, and nets for fishing. There were benches along the sides for summer use, and a great spinning wheel in one hand and a churn at the other. From this piazza, the wondering Ichabod entered the hall, which formed the center of the mansion. Here, rows of resplendent pewter, ranged on a long dresser, dazzled his eyes. In one corner stood a huge bag of wool, ready to be spun. Ears of Indian corn and strings of dried apples, peaches, and red peppers hung in gay festoons along the walls. And a door, left ajar, gave him a peep into the best parlor, where the claw-footed chairs and dark mahogany tables shone like mirrors, and a corner cupboard displayed immense treasures of old silver and well-mended china. From the moment Ichabod laid his eyes upon these regions of delight, His only study was how to gain the affections of the peerless daughter of Van Tassel. In this enterprise, however, he had more real difficulties than generally fell to the lot of a knight-errant of yore, who seldom had anything but giants, enchanters, fiery dragons, and such like easily conquered adversaries to contend with. The lady gave him her hand as a matter of course. Ichabod, on the contrary, had to win his way to the heart of a country coquette, beset with a labyrinth of whims and caprices, which were forever presenting new difficulties and impediments. And he had to encounter a host of fearful adversaries, of real flesh and blood, numerous rustic admirers ready to fly out in the common cause against any new competitor. Among these, the most formidable was a burly, rip-roaring blade named Abraham, or, according to the Dutch abbreviation, Bram van Ront, the hero of the country round, which rang with his feats of strength and hardihood. He was broad-shouldered, double-jointed, with short, curly black hair, and a bluff but not unpleasant countenance, having a mingled air of fun and arrogance. From his Herculean frame and great powers of limb, he had received the nickname of Brom Bones. He was famed for great knowledge and skill in horsemanship, and always ready for either a fight or a frolic, but had more mischief than ill will in his composition. For all his overbearing roughness, there was a strong dash of waggish good humor at the bottom. He had 3 or 4 close companions who regarded him as their model, and at the head of whom he scoured the country, attending every scene of feud or merriment for miles around. Sometimes his crew would be heard dashing along past the farmhouses at midnight with a whoop and a halloo, and the old women, startled out of their sleep, would listen for a moment till the hurried scurry had clattered by, and then exclaim, "Aye, there goes Brom Bones and his gang." The neighbors all looked upon him with a mixture of awe, admiration, and goodwill. And when any madcap prank or rustic brawl occurred in the vicinity, all always shook their heads and warranted Brom Bones was at the bottom of it. This hero had for some time singled out the blooming Katrina for the uncouth object of his uncouth gallantries. And though his amorous toys were something like the gentle caresses and endearments of a bear, yet it was whispered that she did not altogether discourage his hopes. Rival candidates felt no inclination to cross a line in his amours, so much so that when his horse was seen tied to Van Tassel's gate on a Sunday night, a sure sign that his master was courting within, all other suitors passed by in despair. Such was the formidable rival with whom Ichabod Crane had to contend, and considering all things a stouter man than he would have shrunk from the competition. The wiser man would have despaired. He had, however, a happy mixture of pliability and perseverance in his nature, yielding but tough. Though he bent, he never broke, and though he bowed beneath the slightest pressure, yet the moment it was away, jerk! He was as erect and carried his head as high as ever. To have taken the field openly against his rival would have been madness. He therefore made his advances in a quiet and gently insinuating manner. Under cover of his character as singing master, he made frequent visits to the farmhouse, Not that he had anything to apprehend from the meddlesome interference of parents. Bolt Van Tassel was an easy, indulgent soul. He loved his daughter even better than his pipe, and like a reasonable man and an excellent father, let his daughter have her way in everything. His notable little wife, too, had enough to do to attend her housekeeping and manage her poultry, for as she sagely observed, ducks and geese are foolish things and must be looked after, but girls can take care of themselves. Thus, while the busy dame bustled about the house or plied her spinning wheel at one end of the piazza, honest Bolt would sit smoking his evening pipe at the other. In the meantime, Ichabod would carry on his suit with the daughter by the side of the spring, under the great elm, or sauntering along in the twilight. He who keeps undisputed sway over the heart of a coquette is indeed a hero. Certain it is, this was not the case with Brom Bones. And from the moment Ichabod Crane made his advances, the interests of the former evidently declined. His horse was no longer seen tied to the gate on Sunday nights, and a deadly feud gradually arose between him and the schoolmaster of Sleepy Hollow. Brom, who had a degree of rough chivalry in his nature, would gladly have carried matters to open warfare and settled their pretensions to the lady by a single combat. But Ichabod was wary to give him the opportunity. He had overheard a boast of Bones that he would double the schoolmaster up and lay him on a shelf of his old schoolhouse. There was something extremely provoking in that. It left Brom no alternative but to play boorish practical jokes upon his rival. Ichabod became the object of whimsical persecution to Bones and his gang of rough riders. They smoked out his singing school by stopping up the chimney, broke into the schoolhouse at night, and turned everything topsy-turvy. But what was still more annoying, Brom took all opportunities of turning him into ridicule in the presence of his mistress. He had a scoundrel dog that he taught to whine in the most ludicrous manner, and introduced it as a rival of Ichabod's to instruct her in psalm singing. In this way, matters went on for some time, without producing any material effect on the relative situations of the contending powers. On a fine autumnal afternoon, Ichabod, in pensive mood, sat enthroned on the lofty stool from whence he watched over his little realm. In his hand he waved a ruler, that scepter of despotic power. The birch of justice reposed on 3 nails behind the throne, a constant terror to the evildoers. Apparently there had been some appalling act of justice recently inflicted, for his scholars were all busily intent upon their books, or slyly whispering behind them with one eye upon the schoolmaster. Stillness reigned throughout the schoolroom. It was suddenly interrupted by the appearance of a messenger at the schoolhouse door, with an invitation to Ichabod to attend a merrymaking or quilting frolic to be held that evening at Mynheer Van Tassel's. All was now bustle and hubbub in the schoolroom. The scholars were hurrying through their lessons without stopping to trifle. Books were flung aside without being put away on the shelves. Inkstands overturned. The whole school was turned loose an hour before the usual time, bursting forth like a legion of young imps, yelping and racketing across the green. The gallant Ichabod now spent at least an extra half-hour at his toilette, brushing and furbishing up his best, and indeed only a suit of rusty black, arranging his locks by the bit of broken glass that hung in the schoolhouse, that he might make his appearance before the mistress in a true style of a cavalier. He borrowed a horse from the farmer with whom he was domiciled, an old Dutchman by the name of Hans van Ripper. Thus gallantly mounted he issued forth. The animal he bestrode was a broken-down plow horse that had outlived almost everything but its viciousness. He was gaunt, his mane and tail tangled and knotted with burrs. One eye had lost its pupil and was glaring and spectral. But still, he must have had fire and metal in his day, if we judge from the name he bore of Gunpowder. He had, in fact, been a favorite steed of Van Ripper, who was a furious rider, and had infused, very probably, some of his own spirit into the animal. Old and broken down as the horse looked, there was more of the lurking devil in him than in any young filly in the country. Ichabod was a suitable figure for such a steed. He rode with short stirrups, which brought his knees nearly up to the pommel of the saddle. His sharp elbows stuck out like a grasshopper. He carried his whip perpendicularly in his hand like a scepter, and as his horse jogged on, the motion of his arms was not unlike the flapping of a pair of wings. A small wool hat rested upon the top of his nose, and the skirts of his black coat fluttered out almost to the horse's tail. Such was the appearance of Ichabod and his steed as they shambled out of the gate of Hans van Ripper. It was altogether an apparition as is seldom met with in broad daylight. It was, as I have said, a fine autumnal day. The forests had put on their sober brown and yellow, while some trees had been bit by the frosts into brilliant dyes, orange, purple, and scarlet. Small birds fluttered, chirping and frolicking from bush to bush, tree to tree. As Ichabod jogged slowly on his way, his eye ranged with delight over the treasures of jolly autumn. On all sides he beheld vast stores of apples, some hanging in the trees, some gathered into baskets for the market, others heaped up in piles for the cider press. Farther on, he beheld great fields of Indian corn, holding out the promise of cakes and hasty pudding, and yellow pumpkins giving ample prospects of the most luxurious of pies. Soon he passed the fragrant buckwheat fields. As he beheld them, soft anticipation stole over his mind of dainty slapjacks, well buttered and garnished with honey by the delicate little dimpled hands of Katrina Van Tassel. Thus, feeding his mind with many sweet thoughts, he journeyed along the sides of a range of hills that look out upon some of the goodliest scenes of the mighty Hudson. The sun gradually wheeled his broad disk down in the west. The wide bosom of the Tappan Zee lay motionless and placid. A few amber clouds floated in the sky without a breath of air to move them. It was towards evening that Ichabod arrived at the castle of Heer Van Tassel, which he found thronged with the pride and flower of the adjacent country. Old farmers, a spare, leathern-faced race, in homespun coats and breeches, blue stockings, huge shoes, and magnificent pewter buckles. Their brisk, withered little dames in caps, long-waisted short gowns, homegrown and homespun petticoats with scissors and pincushions and gay calico pockets hanging on the outside. Buxom glasses almost as antiquated as their mothers, excepting a straw hat or a fine ribbon, or perhaps a white frock gave symptoms of city innovation. The sons in short, square-skirted coats with rows of stupendous brass buttons. Brom Bones, however, was the hero of the scene. Having come to the gathering on his favorite steed, Daredevil, a creature like himself full of mettle and mischief, and which only he could manage. He was, in fact, noted for preferring vicious animals, given to all kinds of tricks, and kept the rider in constant risk of his neck. The world of charms burst upon the enraptured gaze of my hero as he entered the state parlor of Van Tassel's mansion. Not those of the bevy of buxom lasses, but the ample charms of a genuine Dutch country tea table, heaped with platters of cakes of various and almost indescribable kinds, known only to experienced Dutch housewives. There was the doughty donut and the crisp and crumbling cruller, sweet cakes and shortcakes, ginger cakes, honey cakes. Then there were the apple pies and peach pies and pumpkin pies, besides slices of ham and smoked beef, not to mention the broiled shad and the roasted chickens, all mingled higgledy-piggledy with the motherly teapot, sending up its clouds of vapor from the midst. He was a kind and thankful creature whose heart dilated in proportion as his skin was filled with good cheer, and whose spirits rose with eating as some men's do with drink. He could not help, too, rolling his large eyes around him as he ate, and chuckling with the possibility that he might one day be lord of all this almost unimaginable luxury and splendor. Then he thought how soon he'd turn his back upon the old schoolhouse, snap his fingers in the face of Hans Van Ripper, and kick any itinerant pedagogue out the doors that should dare to call him comrade. Old Walter's Van Tassel moved about among his guests with a face dilated with content and good humor. Round and jolly as the harvest moon, his hospitable attentions were brief, expressive, being confined to a shake of the hand, a slap on the shoulder, a loud laugh, and a pressing invitation to fall to and help themselves. And now, the sound of music from the common room summoned all to the dance. The musician was an old man whose fiddle was as old and battered as himself. The greater part of the time he scraped on 2 or 3 strings, accompanying every movement of the bow with a motion of the head. Ichabod prided himself upon his dancing as much as upon his vocal powers. Not a limb, not a fiber about him as idle as his loosely hung frame clattered about the room in full motion. How could the fodder of urchins be otherwise than animated and joyous? The lady of his heart was his partner in the dance, and smiling graciously in reply to all his amorous oglings, while Brown Bones, sorely smitten with love and jealousy, sat brooding by himself in one corner. When the dance was at an end, Ichabod was attracted to a knot of the sager folks, who, with old Van Tassel, sat smoking at one end of the piazza, gossiping over former times and drawing out long stories about the war. This neighborhood at the time was one of those highly favored places that abound with chronicle and great men. The British and American line had run near it during the war. It had, therefore, been the scene of marauding, infested with refugees, cowboys, and all kinds of border chivalry. Just sufficient time had elapsed to enable each storyteller to dress up his tale with a little fiction and make himself the hero of every exploit. There was the story of Dauphin Martling, a large blue-bearded Dutchman who had nearly taken out a British frigate with an old iron 9-pounder from a mud breastwork, only that his gun burst at the 6th discharge. And there was an old gentleman who, in the Battle of White Plains, parried a musket ball with a small sword. So much so that he absolutely felt it whiz round the blade and glance off at the hilt. As proof, he was ready at any time to show the sword with the hilt a little bent. There were several more that had been equally great in the field and had a considerable hand in bringing the war to a happy termination. But all these were nothing to the tales of ghosts and apparitions that follow. The neighborhood is rich in legendary treasures of the kind, doubtless owing to the vicinity of Sleepy Hollow. Several of the Sleepy Hollow people were present at Van Tassel's, and, as usual, were doling out their wild and wonderful legends. Many dismal tales were told about funeral trains, and mourning cries, and wailings heard and seen about the great tree nearby, where the unfortunate Major Andre was taken prisoner. Some mention was made also of the woman in white that haunted the dark glen at Raven Rock, having perished there in the snow. The chief part of these stories, however, turned upon the favorite specter of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman, who had been heard several times of late patrolling the country, and was said tethered his horse nightly among the graves in the churchyard. The sequestered situation of this church seems always to have made it a favorite haunt of troubled spirits. It stands on a knoll surrounded by locust trees and lofty elms, from among which its decent whitewashed walls shine modestly forth like Christian purity beaming through the shades of retirement. A gentle slope descends from it to a silver sheet of water bordered by high trees, between which peeps may be caught up the blue hills of the Hudson. To look upon its grass-grown yard, where the sunbeams seem to sleep so quietly, one would think that there, at least, the dead might rest in peace. On one side of the church extends a wide woody dell, along which rages a large brook among broken rocks and fallen tree trunks. Over a deep black part of the stream, not far from the church, was formerly thrown a wooden bridge. The road that led to it and the bridge itself were thickly shaded by overhanging trees which cast a gloom about it, even in the daytime, but occasioned a fearful darkness at night. Such was one of the favorite haunts of the Headless Horseman, and the place where he was most frequently encountered. The tale was told of old Brewer, a most heretical disbeliever in ghosts, how he met the horseman returning from his foray into Sleepy Hollow, and was obliged to get up behind him. How they galloped over hill and swamp until they reached the bridge, and the horseman suddenly turned into a skeleton, threw old Brewer into the brook, and sprang away over the treetops with a clap of thunder. This story was immediately matched by a marvelous adventure from Brom Bones, who made light of the galloping Hessian as an errant jockey. He affirmed that on returning one night from the neighboring village of Sing Sing, he had been overtaken by the midnight trooper, that he had offered to race with him for a bold punch, and should have won it too, for Daredevil beat the goblin horse. Just as they came to the church bridge, the Hessian bolted and vanished in a flash of fire. All these tales told in that drowsy undertone with which men talk in the dark, the countenances of the listeners only now and then receiving a casual gleam from the glare of a pipe, sank deep into the mind of Ichabod. He repaid them in kind with large extracts from his invaluable author, Cotton Mather, and added many marvelous events that had taken place in his native state of Connecticut, and fearful sights which he had seen in his nightly walks about Sleepy Hollow. The revel now gradually broke up. The old farmers gathered their families and their wagons and were heard for some time rattling along the hollow roads and over the distant hills. Some of the damsels mounted on pillions behind their favorite knight, and their light-hearted laughter mingling with the clatter of hooves echoed along the silent woodlands, sounding fainter and fainter till they died away and all was silent and deserted. Ichabod only lingered behind to have a tete-a-tete with the heiress, fully convinced that he was now on the high road to success. And what passed at this interview, I will not pretend to say, for in fact I do not know. Something, however, must have gone wrong, for he certainly sallied forth after no great interval with an air quite desolate. Oh, these women. These women. Could that girl have been playing her coquettish tricks? Was her encouragement of the poor schoolmaster only a mere sham to secure her conquest of his rival? Heaven only knows, not I. Let it suffice to say, Ichabod stole forth with the air of one who had been sacking a hen roost rather than a fair lady's heart. Without looking to the right or left, he went straight to the stable, and with several hearty cuffs and kicks, roused his steed most uncourteously from the comfortable quarters in which he was soundly sleeping. It was the very vision time of night that Ichabod, heavy-hearted and crestfallen, pursued his travels homeward, along the sides of the lofty hills that rise above Tarrytown, and which he had traversed so cheerily in the afternoon. The hour was as dismal as himself. Far below him the Tappan Zee spread its dusky and indistinct waters, with here and there a tall mast of a sloop riding quietly at anchor. In the dead hush of midnight, he could even hear the barking of the watchdog from the opposite shore of the Hudson. Now and then, too, the long-drawn crowing of a cock, accidentally awakened, would sound far, far off from some farmhouse away among the hills. No signs of life occurred near him, except occasionally the melancholy chirp of a cricket, or perhaps the guttural twang of a bullfrog from a neighboring marsh, as if sleeping uncomfortably, suddenly turning in his bed. All the stories of ghosts and goblins that he had heard in the afternoon now came crowding upon his recollection. The night grew darker and darker. The stars seemed to sink deeper into the sky. Driving clouds occasionally hid them from his sight. He had never felt so lonely and dismal. He was, moreover, approaching the very place where many of the scenes of the ghost stories had been laid. In the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree, which towered like a giant above all the other trees of the neighborhood and formed a kind of landmark. Its limbs were gnarled and fantastic, twisting down almost to the earth and rising again into the air. It was associated with the tragic story of the unfortunate Andre, who had been taken prisoner nearby and was universally known as Major Andre's tree. The common people regarded it with a mixture of respect and superstition, partly out of sympathy for the fate of its ill-starred namesake, and partly from the tales of strange sights told concerning it. As Ichabod approached this fearful tree, he began to whistle. He thought his whistle was answered, but it was merely a blast of wind sweeping sharply through the dry branches. As he drew nearer, he thought he saw something white hanging in the tree. He paused and ceased whistling, but on looking more narrowly, perceived that it was a place where the tree had been scathed by lightning, and the white wood lay bare. Suddenly he heard a groan. His teeth chattered, his knees knocked against the saddle. It was only the rubbing of one huge bough upon another, as they were swayed about by the breeze. He passed the tree in safety, but new perils lay before him. About 200 yards from the tree, a small brook crossed the road and ran into a marshy and thickly wooded glen known by the name of Wily Swamp. A few rough logs laid side by side served for a bridge over the stream. On that side of the road where the brook entered the wood, a group of oaks and chestnuts matted thick with grapevines threw a cavernous gloom over it. To pass this bridge was the severest trial. It was at this identical spot that the unfortunate Andre was captured. Under the cover of those chestnuts and vines were the sturdy yeomen concealed who surprised him. This has ever since been considered a haunted stream. Fearful are the feelings of the schoolboy who must pass it alone after dark. As he approached the stream, his heart began to thump. He summoned up, however, all his resolution, gave his horse half a dozen kicks in the ribs, and attempted to dash briskly across the bridge. But instead of starting forward, the perverse old animal made a lateral movement and ran broadside against the fence. Ichabod, whose fears increased with the delay, jerked the reins on the other side and kicked. It was all in vain. His speed started, it is true, but it was only to plunge to the opposite side of the road into a thicket of brambles and alder bushes. Ichabod now bestowed both whip and heel upon the ribs of old Gunpowder, who dashed forward, snuffling and snorting, but came to a standstill just by the bridge, with a suddenness that had nearly sent his rider sprawling over his head. Just at this moment, a splashing tramp by the side of the bridge caught the sensitive ear of Ichabod. In the dark shadow of the grove, on the margin of the brook, he beheld something huge, misshapen, and towering. It stirred not, but seemed gathered up in the gloom, like some gigantic monster ready to spring upon the traveler. The hair of the frightened schoolmaster rose upon his head with terror. What was to be done? To turn and fly was now too late, and besides, what chance was there of escaping ghost or goblin, if such it was, which could ride upon the wings of the wind? Summoning up, therefore, a show of courage, he demanded, in stammering accents, Who are you? He received no reply. He repeated his demand in a still more agitated voice. Still, there was no answer. Once more he cudgeled the sides of the inflexible Gunpowder and, shutting his eyes, broke forth with involuntary fervor into a psalm tune. Just then, the shadowy object of alarm put itself in motion, and with a scramble and a bound, it stood at once in the middle of the road. Though the night was dark and dismal, the form of the unknown might now, in some degree, be seen. He appeared to be a horseman of large dimensions, and mounted on a black horse of powerful frame. He made no effort to molest Ichabod or speak to him, but kept aloof on one side of the road, jogging along on the blind side of old Gunpowder, who had now got over his fright and waywardness. Ichabod, who had no relish for this strange midnight companion, recalled the adventure of Brom Bones with the galloping Hessian and quickened his steed in hopes of leaving him behind. The stranger, however, quickened his horse to an equal pace. Ichabod pulled up and fell into a walk, thinking to lag behind. The other did the same. His heart began to sink within him. He tried to resume his song tune, but his parched tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth, and he could not utter a word. There was something in the moody and dogged silence of this unwanted companion that was mysterious and appalling. It was soon fearfully accounted for. On mounting a rising ground which brought the figure of his fellow traveler in relief against the sky, gigantic in height and muffled in a cloak, Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving that he was headless. His horror was still more increased on observing that the head, which should have rested on his shoulders, was carried before him on the pommel of his saddle. His terror rose to desperation. He rained a shower of kicks and blows upon Gunpowder, hoping by a sudden movement to give his companion the slip. But the spectre started full jump with him. Away then, they dashed through thick and thin, stones flying, sparks flashing in every bound. Ichabod's flimsy garments fluttered in the air as he stretched his long, lank body over the horse's head in the eagerness of his flight. They had now reached the road that turns off to Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder, who seemed possessed with a demon, instead of continuing uphill, made an opposite turn and plunged headlong downhill to the left. This road leads through a sandy hollow shaded by trees for about a quarter of a mile, where it crosses the bridge, famous in the goblin story. Just beyond the bridge swells the green knoll on which stands the whitewashed church. Up to this point, the panic of the steed had given his unskillful rider an apparent advantage in the chase. But just as he had got halfway through the hollow, the girths of his saddle gave way, and he felt it slipping from under him. He seized it by the pommel and tried to hold it firm, but in vain. He had just enough time to save himself by clasping old Gunpowder around the neck when the saddle fell to earth and was trampled underfoot by his pursuer. For a moment, the terror of Hans Van Ripper's wrath passed across his mind, for it was his Sunday saddle. But this was no time for petty fears. The goblin was hard on his haunches, and unskillful rider that he was, he had much ado to maintain his seat, sometimes slipping on one side, sometimes on another, sometimes violently jolted on the high ridge of the horse's backbone. An opening in the trees now cheered him with the hopes that the church bridge was at hand. The wavering reflection of a silver star in the brook told him he was not mistaken. He saw the walls of the church dimly glaring under the trees beyond. He recollected the place where Brom Bones' ghostly competitor had disappeared. If I can but reach that bridge, thought Ichabod, I am safe. Just then he heard the black steed panting and blowing close behind him. He even fancied he felt his hot breath. Another convulsive kick in the ribs, and old Gunpowder sprang upon the bridge. He thundered over the resounding planks and gained the opposite side. Now Ichabod cast a look behind to see if his pursuer should vanish, according to rule, in a flash of fire and brimstone. Just then he saw the goblin rising in his stirrups, and in the very act of hurling his head at him. Ichabod strived to dodge the hard missile, but it was too late. It encountered his cranium with a tremendous crash. He was tumbled headlong into the dust, and Gunpowder, the black steed, and the goblin rider passed by like a whirlwind. The next morning, the old horse was found without his saddle and with the bridle his feet, soberly propping the grass at his master's gate. Ichabod did not make his appearance at breakfast. Dinner hour came, but no Ichabod. The boys assembled at the schoolhouse and strolled idly about the banks of the brook, but no schoolmaster. Hans Van Ripper now began to feel some uneasiness about the fate of poor Ichabod and his saddle. An inquiry was set, and after diligent investigation, they came upon his traces. In one part of the road leading to the church was found the saddle trampled in the dirt. Tracks of horse hooves deeply dented in the road, evidently at furious speed, were traced to the bridge, beyond which, on the bank of a broad part of the brook where the water ran deep and black, was found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod, and close beside it, a shattered pumpkin. The brook was searched, but the body of the schoolmaster was not to be discovered. Hans Van Ripper, as executor of his estate, examined the bundle that contained all his worldly effects. They consisted of 2 shirts, 2 stocks to the neck, a pair or 2 of worsted stockings, an old pair of corduroy undergarments, a rusty razor, a book of psalm tunes full of dog's ears, and a broken pitch pipe. As to the books and furniture of the schoolhouse, they belonged to the community, excepting Cotton Mather's History of Witchcraft and a New England Almanac, and a book of dreams and fortune telling. It was in the last that a sheet of paper, much scribbled and blotted in several fruitless attempts to make copy of verses in honor of the heirs of that tassel was found. These magic books and the poetic scrawl were forthwith consigned to the flames by Hans Van Ripper, who from that time forward determined to send his children no more to school, observing that he never knew any good to come of reading and writing. Whatever money that Ichabod possessed, and he had received his quarter's pay a day or 2 before, he must have had about his person at the time of his disappearance. The mysterious event caused much speculation at church the following Sunday. Knots of gazers and gossips were collected in the churchyard, at the bridge, and at the spot where the hat and the pumpkin had been found. The stories of Brewer, of Bones, and many others were called to mind. When they had diligently considered all and compared them with the circumstances of the present case, they shook their heads and came to the conclusion that Ichabod had been carried off by the galloping Hessian. As he was a bachelor and in nobody's debt, nobody troubled his head any more about it. The school was moved to a different location in the hollow, and another schoolmaster reigned in his stead. It is true, an old farmer who had been down to New York on a visit several years later, and from whom this account of the ghostly adventure was received, brought home the news that Ichabod Crane was still alive, that he had left the neighborhood partly through fear of the goblin and Hans Van Ripper, and partly in mortification at having been suddenly dismissed by the heiress, that he had gone to a distant part of the country, had kept school and studied law at the same time, had been admitted to the bar, turned politician, electioneered, written for the newspapers, and finally had been made a justice of the court. Trombone, shortly after his rival's disappearance, conducted the blooming Katrina down the altar in triumph. He was observed to look exceedingly knowing whenever the story of Ichabod was related, and always burst into a hearty laugh at the mention of the pumpkin, which led some to suspect that he knew more about the matter than he chose to tell. The old country wives, however, who are the best judges of these matters, maintain to this day Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means. It is a favorite story, often told in the neighborhood around the winter evening fire. The bridge became more than ever an object of superstitious awe, and that may be the reason why the road has been altered in recent years so as to approach the church by the border of the mill pond. The schoolhouse, being deserted, soon fell to decay and was reported to be haunted by the ghost of the unfortunate Ichabod Crane. The plowboy, loitering homeward of a still summer evening, has often fancied his voice at a distance, chanting a melancholy psalm tune among the tranquil hollows of Sleepy Hollow.